It was just, voting was restricted, and in the industrial societies, it was kind of very weak imitation of democracy. Therefore, national economic policies could be set, and exchange rates could be fixed, and so on, even though there was rapid capital flow. And in fact, a major part of current economic policy is to try to get things back to those happy days when you could sort of disregard the population and just leave decisions in the hands of the right people, financial capital and so on. That's a large part of the history of the last 20 or so years. Now, the truism about free capital flow undermining democracy and the welfare state, that was emphasized quite explicitly by the negotiators, the U.S. and British negotiators at Bretton Woods. And the reasoning is straightforward. Capital controls, that is, restrictions on free movement of capital across borders, they enable governments to carry out fiscal policies like monetary and tax policies that are, from the point of view of investors, irrational. That is, they only help people, not profits. So they sustain employment or sustain incomes and social programs and so on. And such policies can be introduced without fear of capital flight if it's constrained. On the other hand, if there is free flow of capital, you get what some international economists have called a virtual Senate of financial capital. It can impose its own social policies simply by the threat of capital flight, sending the capital out of the country, which leads to higher interest rates and economic slowdown, budget cuts for health and education and so on, and recession or maybe collapse. Basically, the IMF principles, prescriptions, if you look at them. Well, as I say, all of this was articulated very clearly at the time by the U.S. British negotiators, and it's not particularly controversial then or now. If you have free flow of capital, you're going to get a virtual Senate, and democracy and the welfare, the social contract will be undermined. It's important to keep these really pretty elementary observations in mind when you look at the current period. Well, the Bretton Woods system, as originally established, was pretty much in place for about 25 years or so. That's what's often called the golden age of post-war state capitalism. Had, by historical standards, good economic performance, so high rates of growth, both of the economy and of production, expansion of the social contract, and so on. This was dismantled. The system was dismantled from the early 1970s. One major move was when Nixon simply unilaterally abrogated some of the basic principles. The other major financial centers joined in. By the 1980s, capital controls were mostly gone in the rich countries, completely gone. The smaller economies held on to them. South Korea, for example, which is a significant economy, kept them through the 80s. It was compelled to drop them in the early 90s. That's widely regarded as a major factor in the recent collapse, along with radical failures in the private sector throughout East and Southeast Asia. Big topic. I should say, I won't go into it, but I ought to say that serious analysts, at least, consider the East and Southeast Asia are quite different, but the East Asian economic miracle is considered quite real. So, chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, highly regarded economist, after the crisis, he's emphasized that the East Asian economic miracle, as he calls it, was, in his words, an amazing achievement, historically without precedent. He also points out that it was based on quite significant departures from official doctrines, and that it ought to be sustainable unless it's destroyed by financial markets. Let me quote him. He points out that in the East Asian countries, South Korea and Taiwan, government, as in Japan, government took major responsibility for promotion of economic growth, abandoning what he calls the religion that markets know best and intervening to enhance technology transfer, relative equality, education, health, he doesn't say this, but along with industrial policy coordination and strict capital controls. He also mentions that the rich countries had followed somewhat similar paths. as the World Bank has also acknowledged, but nowhere near accurately. And in fact, that's the basis for economic development historically and in every case that we know. Well, what happened after the Bretton Woods system collapsed in early 70s? Essentially, the golden age ended. Since then, it's been a period of much poorer economic performance. Again, you can argue about causal effects, but the facts are not controversial. There's been a slowdown, especially in the industrial world. I mean, let's keep to the industrial world, the Western industrial world. A little variation from place to place, but essentially there's been a slowdown of growth, both of the economy and of productivity, that's noticeable. Also trade, if you look more closely. It's a lot of claims about an explosion of trade, and there's a few instances where it's correct, but overall it's not. Trade seems to be going up relative to the general economy, but that's because the economy has been going down faster than the rate of growth of trade has been going down, so the ratio is higher. That's one major effect, poor economic performance. Secondly, particularly in the United States and England, but to some extent in the general industrial world, incomes have stagnated or declined for the great majority of the population. In the United States, working conditions have gotten a lot worse. Social services, as you know, have deteriorated. Infrastructure's collapsed. There's huge debt. The welfare state is kind of in tatters, sort of what would be expected from the decisions of the virtual Senate. In the United States and in England, inequality which was declining during the Golden Age, it's rapidly increased. It's now back to roughly what it was in the 1920s. That all of these effects leave a kind of superfluous population who aren't don't contribute much to profit formation. In third world dependencies, you carry out things like what's called social cleansing in Colombia, like you kill them or something like that. But this is a civilized society, so we treat them differently. We throw them in jail. And the rate of incarceration has been going up very rapidly, right along with these policies. It's sort of made easier by race, class correlations, and so on. But the basic phenomenon has nothing much to do with them. So throw them in jail. Around 1980, this has nothing to do with crime rates, incidentally. U.S. crime rates are sort of toward the high end of the rich countries, but not off the spectrum. There is one exception, namely killing with guns, but that has to do with the gun culture and the gun laws, not crime rates. And as you'd expect, in around 1980, the United States was within the spectrum, sort of toward the high end, in incarceration of the population. That tripled during the 1980s. It's still going up very fast. It's now 5 to 10 times as high as any other industrial society, and it's long been a world record among any societies that have meaningful statistics. And it's not insubstantial. So, for example, the numbers in prison, the numbers of working age people in prison, would, if you counted them, that would add about 2% to the unemployment rate, which is no small amount. There's also a big prison industry developing, and it's becoming a major private boondoggle, even for big military industry and so on. A lot of money involved. Well, these are other changes. Another change is that, particularly in the 1990s, profits went through the roof. The business press has been just ecstatic through the 90s. Actually, this is up until the middle of this year. Things changed around August. But up until then, the business press was absolutely ecstatic, stupendous, dazzling. They couldn't find words for it. A major change around 1970, early 70s, was an astronomical increase in capital flows that came from the deregulation, and mostly short-term, very short-term, like around 80% of it is a week or less. Means comes back to where it started within a week, often days or hours. The amounts are now huge. Nobody really knows, but it's estimated about $1.5 trillion a day or something of that sort. It's virtually unrelated to the real economy, probably harmful to it. Back in 1970, when the total was far smaller, about 90% of foreign exchanges were estimated to be concerned with the real economy, meaning like investment and trade, 10% speculative. By now, general guesses are around maybe 5% related to the real economy, the rest speculative and very short term, with the effects you'd expect.